And next up, we have a panel of folks from Stantec. And I'll just go ahead and start talking since we know that time is a little bit tight. So the title of their panel today is Shifting Tides of Nature-Based Solutions and Climate Resilience Funding. So we might actually hear the answer to the last question in this panel as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Margaret. Oh, sorry. Welcome to our presentation. We'll discuss past, present, and future funding sources for our nature-based projects. And our goal is that you will come away with a better sense of ongoing funding opportunities in spite of the evolving federal funding landscape and how your projects can be impacted. So our run of show today, we're just going to introduce ourselves, of course, our company and our funding program, talk about the past in the federal funding landscape the last 4 years, and then we have a couple of case studies and some other resilience strategies where we've had success in the last 4 years. Then we're going to talk about the funding scape presently at the federal level. And then we're going to pivot and talk about opportunities at states, foundational, other funding sources that we can leverage for our important climate resilience projects, and of course, leave time for Q&A. So do you want to, or you have microphones too? Okay, great. So I'm Heidi Peper. I'm with Stantec. I'm a senior funding specialist at Stantec. I lead our our North America funding program for the US East. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I've been working on funding infrastructure projects for the last almost 30 years, and certainly have seen many changes in administration at the federal level. David?
Hi, everybody. My name is David Burgy. I'm a senior resilience planner. I wear 2 hats. One hat is focused on climate resilience planning, and the other is helping clients secure funding through a variety of sources, working with Heidi.
I'm Jenny Hamann. I'm a senior associate at Stantec, and I specialize in landscape architecture. I do a wide variety of projects, which also include resilience projects.
Thank you. I'm Rachele McKnight. I'm an environmental scientist at Stantec. I have a background in landscape architecture, arboriculture, and wetlands science, and at Stantec I primarily work on nature-based solutions and ecosystem restoration.
Awesome. So just a little bit about Stantec. We are a global multidisciplinary engineering firm. These are our core values, and we believe that this is important to highlight just because we truly do integrate them into all of our projects and interactions with clients. Putting people first, we're better together. Oops. We do what is right, and we are driven to achieve. Again, global company, more than 32,000 employees globally, 450 locations worldwide. And we are a global leader in sustainable engineering, architecture, and environmental consulting. And you can see all of the sectors within those pillars of our work there. A bit about our North America funding program. So Stantec created this funding program to be the bridge between our clients and their need for funding for their important projects. So we have more than 250 funding specialists across Canada and the US. We've leveraged more than 100 federal, state, foundational funding programs, securing more than $8 billion for our clients and their projects. We've achieved this success because we take a life cycle approach to funding. Funding should not be a step at the end of a plan set or design, but truly working alongside our technical experts from the beginning, from planning and design all the way up to construction, because oftentimes planning and design can inform funding and vice versa. 3 major buckets of services. We can help with funding research and strategy, the applications, and then grant administration once those funds are secured. And we can help out with as many or as few of these buckets as needed. So let's talk about the funding landscape in the past 4 years. As you all know, it was historic times of federal investment, starting with the American Rescue Plan Act, Then the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and lastly, the Inflation Reduction Act. So a bit about IJA and the divisions of funding. And as you can see there, the orange shades, those are transportation sector funding programs, which truly did incorporate addressing climate change and equity in all of these programs. The reason transportation was such a huge winner, if you will, was because it was also the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act. But there was quite a bit of funding for water, resiliency, broadband types of projects. Then, with the Inflation Reduction Act, this act really took a financial approach to providing, or to tackle the climate change crisis in providing tax incentives and competitive grants and loans for these projects. What you see here is the division for those competitive grants and loans and how the IRA funding was divided. And here you see that the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, received a large portion of those funds. Themes that we saw throughout all of those pieces of legislation under the former administration, you can see this word cloud: resilience, community, climate, energy, front and center, that led the way for all of those investment initiatives. Now we're going to get into a couple of case studies, as I mentioned, and some other resilience funding strategies that we've seen in action over the last 4 years before we talk about the present. So David will start us off.
Thanks, Heidi. So the first case study we'll go through is, it's in Nassau County. It's a county on Long Island of about 1.4 million people. And so in this project example, we'll talk about work that's restoring Hempstead Bay, community resilience, and improved habitat quality. My experience on this project was actually prior to joining Stantec. It was while I was working for New York State. And while I was with New York State, I was primarily working on Superstorm Sandy recovery. It was a $50 billion event in terms of damage, or even more. And New York State was awarded $4.5 billion in HUD, Housing and Urban Development block grants, to their CDBG-DR disaster recovery block grants. New York City also received $4.4 billion or so, and New Jersey received $4.2 billion. So New York State established an Office of Storm Recovery. It was a temporary office in order to manage this funding, and part of that funding was an allocation for rebuild design projects. Some of you may have heard of Rebuild by Design before. Some of the biggest projects in New York. We had a Living Breakwaters project, and then the other New York State RBD project was Living with the Bay. It was a broader effort to focus on restoration of the Mill River watershed that feeds into Hempstead Bay, and it had a lot of issues during Sandy. When the storm surge hit, it pushed the water into the sewer system and actually, surcharged into people's homes, into the surrounding community. It caused substantial damage, and so this was an area of specific focus for the state on figuring out how to live with the bay. So 10 years later, the recovery effort was still underway, but in the tail end of things. And Governor Hochul announced the creation of a permanent office. So as the transition from temporary office to permanent, we still had many unmet needs, despite the almost 4.4 of the $4.5 billion being spent. And so the emphasis became shifting to securing funding for for finishing out the projects that had been scoped. So it's not an unusual situation where you're going through a disaster recovery effort. You have a number of projects and you're not quite able to make it work. And so that became a focus. And shown here is the funding that was received by Nassau County, so it was quite substantial. So now I'll pivot to National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this organization. It was created by Congress in 1984 and is the nation's largest private conservation foundation. They partner with state, local, and federal governments, corporations, and foundations. And what's interesting about NFWF is they really take these different funding sources together and they shake them up, they blend them together, and then they're able to give out grant funding. And so in 2018, they established the National Coastal Resilience Fund. This was under the previous Trump administration. And so it blends NOAA funding, Department of Defense funding in certain eligible areas, and then private philanthropic funding, I think from Shell, for example. And so this is a map that shows the location of the project that I'll be talking about. This is a really interesting fund because they've invested over $600 million in, I think, almost 200 projects. They've been able to leverage conservation resources and really maximize their impact by leveraging those funds. So the context for the project that we didn't quite have enough funding to make it work, it's the Long Beach Consolidation Project. So again, in that context with the bay, there was an acknowledgement of a need for additional pump stations, force main, and a marshland restoration project. The goals are to improve water quality in the bay, to also restore the ability to fish, to enhance storm protection with a lot of relatively urbanized areas around the bay, and restore wetlands. Here's a map of the site. So where the South Shore is labeled, that's near the Bay Park, basically wastewater treatment plant. And that was I think over $800 million project. It was blending HUD funding together with FEMA funding, really large scale. And New York State put in, I think, $101 million for a lot of the work there. And then the marshland is sort of between South Shore and the city of Long Beach. Quite a lot of work there to be done as well, which is what we ended up applying for. And then Long Beach, there's the water pollution control plant. And all of these areas were just inundated by Sandy. And so it's definitely been a major area of focus. So let's get to the actual project. So restoring Hempstead Bay. So we estimated this would be about a almost $16 million project. We weren't quite able to make it work with New York State, and so we were able to find matching funds of about $5.5 million. But we applied for one of the largest NIFWIF NCRF grants, and we were successful in getting that. Funding $10 million for implementation. Typically, the planning type grants from this funding source are $100,000 to $1 million. Implementation projects are about $1 million to $10 million. So we were right at that upper threshold. And although matching funds weren't required, we were able to demonstrate that we were really committed to making this project work and making that project whole. What's interesting about this funding source in particular is with NIFWIF, there's an emphasis on benefiting species, benefiting communities, and restoring habitats. So I call out a couple of the species that are expected to benefit from this project. We see ability to slow storm surge and improve the habitat. And so now I'll show, these are actual project sites we went out with Nassau County on a boat, and we got to see the actual site pre-implementation. And so the project will restore the hydrology of the marshes islands. It'll fill historic ditches that were originally designed to drain the landscape, but ended up causing damage and erosion. The project would create new runnels to bring tidal waters back into the marsh. And plants and salt-tolerant vegetation will be implemented. The dock that's there will be demolished. So it really took a number of different funding sources to make this project happen. It took many years of planning to get to this point, to get through design, to get through permitting. And so I think NIFWIS is a really interesting funding source, and one that we should all keep in mind for nature-based solutions. So now I get to pass it off to Jenny, who will talk about another New York project. Thanks.
Thanks, David. There we go. So I'm gonna go over with you a case study, a Tottenville Shoreline Protection Project in Tottenville, Long Island, or Staten Island. I have worn many hats on this project. It is a long-running project. I went from landscape architecture technical lead to PM to somewhere between all of those at this point. So I'm gonna give you a sense of location. So those of you that don't know New York City, Tottenville is on the very, very southern tip of Staten Island. It sits on the Raritan Bay. It is fully on public land associated with Conference House Park, but the Raritan Bay does open up to the Atlantic Ocean right there. This one. So here's the full extent of our project. We have about 25 acres of project at this point, 5,700 linear feet of beach, immediately adjacent to a residential community. And again, if you don't know Staten Island, I would refer to it as a dense suburban kind of style when you get this far out. So you have a lot of single-family homes, on very tightly knit lots. So Hurricane Sandy came in and devastated this section of Staten Island due to its proximity to the Raritan Bay. The waves were knocking houses off their foundations. We had loss of life, 2 lives. This is immediately adjacent to our property. Another building immediately adjacent to the property where debris completely devastated these buildings. So initially, they put in a temporary dune, sand trap bags along the shore. The goal of the project was to put something a little bit more permanent in beyond this, because this obviously won't last very long. And it's hard to mention the Tottenville project without mentioning the Living Breakwaters project. We were managed closely by the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery together. We are permitted together for a number of items. The Living Breakwaters project actually got built, was finalized this past September. But the idea behind the 2 projects is that we are a layered approach to protecting this community. The breakwaters obviously mitigate the wave action, creating calmer waters, and then ours is an additional measure of protection on land. So with that, our original scope, if you remember the image of the temporary dune, that would have been on the original scope identified here in zones 1 and 2. That has the highest priority in terms of needed protection, level 2 having the highest level of wave action damage. Level 1 also had some wave action damage, but it also had some community support behind it. So we maintained, including some mitigation measures back there. Zone 2 having the community is closer to the waterfront at that segment. Later, as the studies developed, there's also a study going on, the Raised Shorelines project, which is immediately adjacent to our project, which got added to our scope years later. The goal of that one is to address sea level rise and erosion. So combined, we have the entire scope of our project through tons of varying sources of funding, but all pretty much through the state and federal. So we developed a design throughout the project. Obviously, the temporary dune was the original scope of work. The client, we had to educate the client on the fact that replacing it with a permanent dune, we really didn't have the space for it almost anywhere along the project. So we did have to implement a number of nature-based solutions throughout different segments. So along the top, I know it's kind of hard to see the overall plan, but along the top, you can see there's the earthen berm through the maritime forest, rock core planted, and it meanders through the trees. Then the next segment is a wetland eco-revetment. There is a small batch of wetland that runs through there. We were required to minimize our footprint, so obviously a dune won't suffice there. So we have a revetment running through there. And then the hybrid dune, where we are the Living Breakwaters project did some beach replenishment to allow us to have space to actually include a dune. But again, we had to do a rock core with sand over top that was planted. And then Surf Avenue eco-revetment, again, very narrow segment. It's an area where we had a lot less space. The beach is very narrow. We were able to use a majority of Parks Department, New York City Parks Department property, in a combination with DOT. right-of-way, but this segment of the street was actually built out. So we were very, very pinched here. So we went with an eco-revetment and then the raised edge along the rest of the segment, which throughout the entire length of this, they are creating a walking path that connects to the existing Conference House Park. So Brick Grant 2020, COVID hits. We are at about 80 to 90% design. The Living Breakwaters project is out to bid. We hit a standstill, like I'm sure most projects we're running into. We went through a process of working through finalizing our design. The Governor's Office of Storm Recovery was also, obviously a lot of these have time limits. With the realization of the slowdowns through COVID and a number of issues with budgeting where the bids came back for the other project due to the construction costs going up, decisions had to be made and some of our funding was reallocated to the other project because we simply weren't going to make our timelines. So with that, internally, we found some other sources. This became a really great opportunity for us. A lot of the goals of the project, of this grant matched our project mitigation, nature-based solutions. We seemed like such a perfect fit, but we did have to go through some feasibility studies. So we brought this to our client. We did some initial studies to see, can we actually meet the data criteria that hits this? Once we proved that to the city, that we were pretty sure we could meet this, we proceeded with collecting more data, trying to prepare the application and working with their review, because the city has their own reviewing agency that manages the applications as well. This is a photo of the wetland eco-revetment. We were able to continue. So as you can see, again, nature-based solutions, resilience, reducing risk, we lined up pretty perfectly. We were really hopeful as we went through this process. This photo here is the little orange shack is that building from the earlier photos where the tree was through the property. So immediately adjacent to our site, we're trying to improve the community's resilience. So where do we stand now? We were awarded, or we were selected in 2021. As I understand it, our client has an agreement in place. The funding, we believe, will still be there. Obviously, that changes day to day. We're very hopeful that it will still be there when we go to bid. Since then, we've been working with the client to secure additional funding, their additional funding, as it's a 75-25% match. So we were selected and kind of allotted, I think it was around $25 million for the brick grant with a 6.5 approximate match from the city. So through that, we've been finalizing the design, securing our permits, working through that, and now we're in the bid process and remaining hopeful that then those funds will still be there for us later. So thank you. I'm going to pass it off to Rachele.
Thanks, Jenny. So moving on, we're going to discuss resilience strategies a little bit more broadly. I've just chosen 3 resiliency strategies because there are so many. And we're going to discuss a little bit of the federal funding changes that we've been seeing so far in 2025. And as everybody understands, there's a lot going on, so we can't capture it all, but we're going to at least give you some of the highlights, I suppose you could say. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some state funding mechanisms that might assist to move projects forward, with the understanding that we're just talking about a couple of them. Again, there is a lot that's out there and there's a lot that's evolving. And there's a lot of acronyms as well, so I'm going to be using notes so that you guys actually get the definitions of all these different programs. So I'm going to start with urban forests. I'm an arborist. I'm totally in love with trees, and urban forests are one of my favorite resiliency strategies. We use forests in urban settings to combat urban heat island, to improve our air quality, to improve public health, mental health, sense of place, all of these really extraordinary benefits. We've seen so far that the administration has pulled $75 million in funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. That funding was going to be administered through the Arbor Day Foundation. The funding was going to go to 100 different cities across the country to plant trees, especially in underserved communities, and all of that funding was pulled because of DEI language. Fortunately, by and large, people also like trees. Like, I'm not the only one who likes trees, so that's pretty cool. So in Massachusetts, when I talk about state programs, I'm just going to be limited to Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut because there's lots of states in the Northeast, and again, we're kind of short on time. But there's the Challenge program in Massachusetts. This offers 50-50 matching grants for tree planting programs in environmental justice areas. Sometimes the grants can be up to 75% with a match of 25%. In New York State, we're really, really fortunate. We have a lot of community reforestation grant programs available for municipal settings, and then we have larger state reforestation grants for rural areas. In Connecticut right now, there are urban forest resiliency grants, and that can help to replace tree species that have been impacted by emerald ash borer. Does everybody in the room understand what's going on with emerald ash borer? Can I get some nods? Yeah, so there's a lot of trees, especially in certain urban settings, especially where the ash trees have been decimated by the emerald ash borer. That's a pest that came in and has ravaged a lot of the trees in the Northeast. So moving on, another resilience strategy, of course, is flood control. We're talking about that a lot. We just went over some of the situations that are happening, or the situation that's happening with brick right now. I'm sure that you all have probably seen in the news last week. Was last week, right? Like, everything's just happening so fast. But brick was actually formally eliminated. Any funds that have not been allocated so far are going to be returned to the Treasury. This is administered through FEMA. So the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, both of those are still active. So we're happy about that. The DOT, we have worked on projects before that use the PROTECT program for funding for resiliency work. PROTECT stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, Cost-Saving Transportation. So there's some really great key words in there, right? This program has unfortunately been paused and it's under review. It hasn't gone away though, so we can keep our fingers crossed on that. Fortunately, there are quite a few programs out there on a state level for flood control and resiliency in municipal settings. In Massachusetts, of course, there's a municipal vulnerability preparedness program, the coastal habitat and water quality program, the coastal resiliency grants. We just learned a lot about that in the last session, so that's really awesome. I even learned quite a bit from that. Very, very cool. In New York, we have the Conservation and Land Use Program that's administered by the Hudson River Estuary Program, and that's really cool because they also have funding for open space preservation, which is one of my favorite resiliency approaches. Like, the open space that we do have left, we should try to conserve as much as possible and not develop it wherever feasible so that we can maintain it for flood storage and biodiversity and climate resilience. So we've got great programs. In New York State, we also have Resilient New York and other programs that are administered through the Environmental Bond Act that was passed in 2022, and I voted for that, so I'm happy to see that that went through as well. In Connecticut, we have the Connecticut DEEP, Climate Resiliency Fund. That fund does use some federal dollars. It's not completely administered by the state or funded by the state, so that's going to be obviously in a little bit of flux as we go on. Okay. All right, so I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go really fast on this next one. So complete streets and green infrastructure I consider to be a really good tool for climate resilience, and I think about that because anytime we can get more bicyclists and active transportation users out and about, it's less vehicles that need to be used and therefore less emissions. So right now, from a federal standpoint, the DOT has the Safe Streets for All program. In 2025, the NOFO was recently released. There are eligible activities but the language around equity and climate change has unfortunately been removed. Something else that's changed is the Safe Streets for All used to be focused on underserved communities, and now that the language has changed for that to areas of persistent poverty. And some of the supplemental planning activities have gone away, particularly those that are related to equity and vulnerable users. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program is currently paused. That really doesn't have anything to do with complete streets necessarily. However, it's also a way to reduce emissions, right? But that's just currently paused, so it hasn't gone away altogether. So state programs, I'm trying to go really fast here. The Mass DEP administers stormwater grants, stormwater pollution control grants. That definitely helps with the green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is often used for stormwater and flood control, especially when it's combined with urban forestry and wonderful bioswales and things like that we like to see in our urban areas. In New York, we have the Transportation Alternatives Program. That has not been distributed since 2023, but I have seen a lot of press announcements about it recently, so hopefully that's coming back. And Connecticut has a number of different programs, including the Community Connectivity Grant Program and different capital improvement programs. So I'm going to hand it back over to Heidi. I know that we're kind of running low on time, but she's going to continue to discuss other broader federal funding changes and what we might see for foundation funding opportunities moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Rachele. So the hard part, federal funding landscape presently. And Rachele touched on many of these. There are a lot of question marks out there, a lot of unknowns, but a few things that we do know that have happened in just the last 3 months. There were 4 notice of funding opportunities or NOFOs that were open when there was the change in administration. One was the RAISE program, major DOT, Department of Transportation funding program. They changed that program. Unfortunately, they removed all evaluation criteria related to equity and climate change. The Port Infrastructure Development Program was also open. They paused that NOFO. They reissued it mid-February. Ironically, it is still the same. It has all of the same language as the previous NOFO and even refers to President Biden's climate change executive order. So I'm not sure if they missed something or if they're still going to change it, but they're due on April 30th. So that's interesting. Rachele mentioned the PROTECT program that has been paused, and DOT is now saying that they expect a spring 2025 reissuing of that NOFO. Again, BRIC was pulled and then canceled. We've had more than 100 executive orders and presidential memorandums. Agencies were directed to review all of their funding programs and also to reprioritize the unobligated IJA and IRA funding. So it has been a whirlwind of the last 3 months. Project 2025, it's received a lot of attention, I guess, and debate as to whether that truly is going to be a playbook for this administration. Some of the authors, if not all of the authors, now hold key positions within the administration. So we thought it would be helpful. Okay. Here are the changes that are recommended. These are recommended, these are suggestions. They would need an act of Congress and likely could face challenges. But here are some federal agencies, just pulled those that you might be most interested in. So you can see FEMA, dismantling the parent agency, and the which is the Department of Homeland Security, and putting FEMA into or underneath the Department of Interior or the Department of Transportation. Raise the threshold for FEMA declarations, changing the cost share from 75% federal to 25%. Hazard mitigation, recommended to terminate those programs. NOAA, dismantling many of its functions, that they would either be eliminated, sent to other agencies, and or states and territories. EPA, reprioritizing for those areas that are most in need, And more funding for clean water, so through the state revolving fund program. That program can fund stormwater projects. EDA, abolish and reallocate funding. If not able to, better coordinate funding with, coordinate disaster funding with better decision-making and better coordination among agencies. One interesting thing under the EDA is they're recommending bolstering opportunity zones. So we first saw opportunity zones in the previous Trump administration. So this is prioritizing private investment in disadvantaged communities. DOT, again, you can see the range of recommendations there. The biggest thing is the federal government is wanting to absolve all federal discretionary grant programs and instead allocate, whether it's DOT or FEMA funding, via formula to states to distribute as they see best fit. So that could be valuable to us in states where they prioritize climate change and equity if the control of that funding is given to the states. And just more. We're out of time. I feel like I'm getting yanked from the stage.
That's what I volunteered to do.
Yeah, I know. I'm not blaming you. There are, Rachele talked about, and Jenny and David pointed to many state programs. There are also regional, national, state foundations that work in this space. So let's not despair. Let's find some opportunities and navigate through these next 4 years together. And now we have time for Q&A. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
We do have time for Q&A.
Who has the first question?
I can ask a question.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I agree, we shouldn't despair, even though that was very bad news. Over the past 4 years, though, there was a lot of concern about the sustainability of funding for nature-based solutions because we've relied so much on grants, and it was a good time in terms of grants. But I'm wondering if you could say anything about innovative financing mechanisms that you know of that maybe we need to scale up now, like environmental impact bonds or other things, projects that can generate some revenue, green banks are coming online, and things like that. Thanks. David, in the spirit of hope.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. Okay, so I think, as Rachele was mentioning, a lot of the innovation that we're seeing is happening at the state level and the local level. So, for example, in Vermont, they're matching, they're doing the FEMA match, the local match, using state funds. And so they're able to fill the gap for communities that otherwise would not be able to access that funding. And FEMA HMGP funds can be used for nature-based solutions. It's not an innovative program in some ways, but it's still an option that's out there. The funding requirements mean that the projects need to be cost-effective. We also see states like Connecticut that have a climate resilience fund. New York State passed a $4.2 billion Environmental Bond Act. Again, I think a lot of the innovation is happening at the state and local levels. And I think we're going to have to just see where things head in the future. Rachele, anything to add?
Yeah, so just to kind of, I guess, piggyback on that a little bit, I know that even over the last 4 years and before that, that often working with municipalities, sometimes there are some really large projects that would require a tremendous amount of funding to actually complete or to implement or to move into sort of any sort of design or feasibility stage. And often municipalities will really get gun shy because they'll see this huge number and then they're just like, we just can't go after that much funding. We don't have the capacity, we don't have the resources. So in the spirit of not despairing, I would like to say, like, there's probably not going to be nearly as much money from a state level necessarily, at least not immediately, like there was from the feds. However, I think it's important to think about projects from a phased approach and try to make sure that we're not like losing our momentum. So even if we need to bite off smaller chunks of projects or do pilot projects, just to kind of keep things going and keep the conversation going and keep communities engaged, I think it's really important to do that.
I'll add one more thing, which is I'm a perpetual fan of Mitchell Silver. He's an amazing planner, and he always taught, when he was the New York City Parks Commissioner, his focus was on analyzing their capital program to understand how their funds were either advancing or not advancing equity in communities. So anytime a locality, a local government is spending money as part of their capital program, if they take an equity lens or a nature-based solutions lens to the project work, every dollar spent presents an opportunity to innovate. So I think there's no shortage of opportunity using the existing apparatuses that we have. It's just the federal funding landscape is definitely going through a shift right now. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add, although not necessarily innovative, let's reframe our projects. So while we can't say addressing climate change, what are all of the benefits of the particular project? There are other words that we can use, but what are the direct and indirect benefits of doing the project? We heard this morning, a lot of these projects have economic development benefits, outdoor recreation, tourism, workforce development. Let's reframe how we're looking at our projects in going after maybe more traditional funding sources.
Any other questions?
Hi, I had one. So historically, when folks talk about infrastructure, large infrastructure project, you're like, follow the money. And I'm not interested anymore in following the money because I feel like the money is not where it needs to be going. So given where we find ourselves in terms of headwinds or tailwinds or whatever kind of winds we are facing, what are the opportunities besides looking at philanthropy? Because I feel like philanthropy has a lot more sectors to fund, and we cannot, maybe we can look at some sector of this being filled by philanthropy, but besides reframing everything from equity and climate resilience and calling it something different, where do you see the opportunity in sustaining this work without making it exhausting? Because, it's exhausting to try and reframe things that we've all fought for in different words. So I'm just looking for some creative thinking around, if we say we want to just sustain this space beyond the 4 years, what do you suggest communities do?
Where do you find the money beyond philanthropy?
Yeah.
It's a good question. States, Massachusetts, as we heard, has a lot of good state programs. Connecticut, Minnesota, depending upon where you are from, there are a lot of states that have their own state programs funded by state dollars that are not beholden to the federal government and what their evaluation criteria are.
I just want to point out that this is happening really fast, and all of us right now are kind of in the thick of it, and we're trying to adapt, and we don't necessarily have all the answers yet, and that's why we're here, because we want to work with all of you to develop those ideas and to remain curious and to find innovative approaches to be able to continue to do this work. So I think that moving forward, we all need to really work together and to share these ideas and to share information, because when you're talking about having the energy to move forward, especially when this is such a hard fight and it really is exhausting, what I know is I gain a lot of energy from the people around me who are also doing this work. So I guess that I would just ask that we all try to be sensitive to one another and to understand that we're all in this together and to support each other. I know that sounds like a little more emotionally based, but that's kind of where we're at, right? We don't really know what the future holds yet, but we have to remain positive.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Thanks, Stantec, for your great panel and updating us on the current situation. And you'll be around if anybody else has questions for you? Okay, great. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks.